Some 75% of young voters, that's 18 to 24-year-olds, backed staying in Europe. It sounds high, but that figure comes from the number that did actually vote. Voter apathy among the young was long recognised as a potential problem. There was a huge drive to try and get young people to connect with the issues of the referendum. But it seems like that connection was never made. According to estimated figures, only a little over 30% of 18 to 24-year-olds did vote. Away from the capital in the north and the Midlands is where the Brexit battle was won.
I think the irony to observe here is that if David Cameron had let 16 and 17-year-olds have the vote, he'd still have his job, and we'd still have it.
These boys and girls are members of a youth parliament, so they're no strangers to the issues.
Well, just a day after the referendum results, Scotland's devolved government began a drive to stay in the EU. Emerging from a hastily arranged cabinet meeting, the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, said she would seek immediate discussions with Brussels to protect Scotland's interests. She also insisted a second independence referendum was very much on the table. The Sky's James Matthews reports.
Inside and out, it was a day to reflect at Bute House. Scotland's political leadership gathered inside their First Minister's residence for the first time since Thursday's vote. Their decision here was on where they go next. Geographically and politically, the answer is Brussels.
A second independence referendum is clearly an option that requires to be on the table, and it is very much on the table. Cabinet agreed that we will seek to enter into immediate discussions with the EU institutions and with other EU member states to explore all possible options to protect Scotland's place in the EU.
She didn't necessarily want to be planning a Scottish independence referendum quite so soon behind the door of number 6 Charlotte Square. Not with less time to build support and to overcome obstacles, old and new.
All of the difficulties associated with independence a couple of years ago still exist, and in some cases, currency, border, fiscal balance, they are much more complicated than they were a year and a half ago. So anyone thinking that any of the options on the table, including independence, are easy or straightforward, needs to have a long lie down.
Anecdotally, there's been an EU referendum bounce among Scots. In Edinburgh's West End, I went in search of people who'd voted against Scottish independence in 2014. How would they vote next time round? First stop, Edinburgh University's graduation ceremony.
I'd probably vote to go independent, yeah.
Why?
I think it's the uncertainty of not being in Europe now.
I'd vote for independence, so I'd vote yes.
Why?
Because I feel that Scotland would be better off in the EU. I'd be a more progressive, liberal country.
I would probably vote to leave now.
Why?
Because I wanted to stay in Europe, and I think that as Scotland we might be able to do that.
But at the wedding up the road, a reflection of the challenge that Nicola Sturgeon still faces. After last Thursday, how would you vote in a future referendum?
I would still vote to stay with the UK. I definitely think we'd be better off staying together at the moment.
I would still vote no for independence the next time round as well.
I know we've went in the wrong direction, but if we can get things right, I don't see any reason why we should go for independence.
Out with independence, what mechanism could there be for Scotland to retain an association with the European Union? Could it be a member of the UK and the EU at the same time? At the moment, the Scottish Government isn't pretending it has an answer. So much in this new political era remains up in the air. James Matthews, Sky News, Edinburgh.
Well, the referendum results also having ramifications for Northern Ireland, with a huge surge of interest from people wanting to obtain Irish citizenship. The Post Office in Northern Ireland says it's seen an unusually high number of people in Northern Ireland seeking Irish passport applications since the vote. But in the hours that followed the result, the status of the border between the north and south also has become a central issue. Sky's David Blevins travelled across that border to test opinions on both sides.
The UK has left the EU station. Some Northern Ireland passengers would rather leave the train. Just beyond Newry in County Down, there's a soft border, and no one at the annual farm show here wants to see it hardened.
I know I have family that live cross-border, and it would be far too much hassle just to have me go through customs and everything, and it would only start riots and all again.
Probably there should be a poll, but I couldn't see a new border being, come back in again. I couldn't see it, definitely not.
The troubles was the biggest problem we have with the border. We have no troubles now, so I can't see that. I can't see them putting up a wall.
It used to be the most militarised border in Western Europe, frequently bombed, but the armoured checkpoints are long gone.
One of the really big things for me, one of the tangible parts of the peace process, having grown up on the border, was to see those deconstructed. And now when you travel from Dublin to Belfast, the only difference you will know, the only reason you will know you've crossed over the border, is a slight change in the road surface and the fact that the kilometres in the Republic of Ireland, the road signs have changed into miles, but that's all you'll know.
There are no physical barriers between Northern Ireland and the Republic, but the line between them will have to become a customs and immigration border. You can't just ignore the fact that there are 400 million citizens of the EU on the other side of it. If we can drive from the United Kingdom into the European Union, as we just have, then they can come in the opposite direction. Sinn Féin wants a referendum on removing the border, on reunification. Liz O'Donnell, a former Irish foreign minister, says that's premature and provocative, but possible.
It is true that there is a facility down the road for a plebiscite on the matter of Irish reunification, as provided for in the Good Friday Agreement. And I think it's legitimate, as it has been for Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland, to anticipate that they will seek another referendum on Scottish independence, because they don't want to be taken out of the European Union against their democratic wishes. And I can see that people in Northern Ireland would feel that way too.
From the peace process to bilateral trade topping £1 billion a week, Britain and Ireland were linked by their EU membership. The British might have made the decision, but things could get turbulent for the Irish too. David Blevins, Sky News in Dublin.
Well, the results also threatening to deepen the crisis in Britain's steel industry, with several bidders for Tata Steel's British operations said to be close to abandoning their talks. They say the UK's decision to leave the EU threatens to deepen the crisis enveloping the country's biggest steel producer. The Sky News has learned that the billionaire tycoon Wilbur Ross, among 7 shortlisted bidders, has signalled that Brexit now diminishes the chances he'll pursue a takeover. Well, other implications too for businesses and for consumers. After sweeping claims from both sides during the referendum campaign, the reality of life outside the EU is beginning to dawn, as our consumer affairs correspondent Poppy Trowbridge has been looking at the effects we might see from our summer holidays to the supermarket shop.
Yes, please. Aubergine and tomato, please.
The weekly shop won't wait while the politicians work out what happens next. Friday's result will mean big changes for consumers in many parts of everyday life. But there are some much more pressing than others. The value of the pound slid after the Leave vote.
Mango, yes? Yeah, 3, please.
All right, thank you very much. Nice, organic, natural mango.
Perfect, thank you.
That makes importing goods, from fruit to farming equipment, cost more. Rising inflation is now a real risk.
Lovely. Thank you very much. This is the best measure of inflation, the price of a single lemon. After consumer prices have stayed steady for about 2 years now, they are expected to rise over the next 2.
In early January, £1,000 was worth €1,360. The day of the referendum, it was worth just over €1,300. Today, £1,000 will buy you €1,230. That's about £100 less for your holiday budget.
Consumers are going to see higher costs. We're going to see more expensive flights and more expensive insurance. Why? Very simply, pound has gone down, things cost more when they're spent abroad. So if you make an insurance claim, for example, that insurer is going to have to pay more to cover the costs. That will come back in higher premiums for us as consumers.
While inflation rises, finance experts say interest rates are likely to change too.
The forwards and futures markets that look at these things are now suggesting a 0.25% rate cut in the UK pretty much in the next month. And in fact, Mark Carney, Governor of the Bank of England, could cut even further so that base rates are 0%. Now, if you are on a tracker mortgage, that essentially means your mortgage could get even cheaper, and if your tracker is set at the level of base rates and base rates go to zero, you could be borrowing for nothing.
While many parts of our future are simply not mapped out yet, what happens on global money markets will influence what happens to the pounds in our pockets. Poppy Trowbridge, Sky News.
The lower the Leave vote was, the higher the Remain vote was.
Matt, you've been studying voters for UKIP and other parties on the right. Is there a correlation there? Is it also the case that people without degrees tend to be tempted by UKIP and things like that?
Very strong overlap between the UKIP vote and what we saw at the referendum. These are voters essentially who have been having a very different experience with globalisation and the European integration, who don't have the qualifications and the skills to adapt and prosper amid a very competitive environment.
So the higher up you are, basically, the more likely you were to vote to leave. Let's look at the next graph, which is areas employment. This looks at large numbers of people in jobs requiring a degree, and no surprise there that that's pretty much the same pattern.
Precisely, and this is one thing we do have to be aware of with this kind of chart, which is that sometimes the relationship you're seeing may be caused by a factor that isn't on screen. So here, sure, it looks like the more people you have in professional occupations, the lower the Leave vote was, but that's driven again by the same dynamic.
I mean, I've read, I don't know whether it's true, that education was the single biggest indicator whether you voted Leave or Remain.
It's certainly a powerful indicator, but we also have to bear in mind that there are attitudes at play as well. So how you feel about immigration, for example, was a really big driver of the Leave vote. I calculated as well this morning, building on that, that the average wage in the top Brexit areas was £18,000 a year. The average wage in the top Remain areas was around 30 to 35,000
So it's people who are doing less
a year.
well who are more inclined to...
People who you might argue have been left behind.
Well, let's look at areas where large numbers of people don't hold a passport. These are people who obviously haven't been abroad recently. And again, without a passport, that's moving to the right. Leave is higher up, and we see, again, if you don't have a passport, if you haven't been abroad, you're more likely to be...
Precisely, and I think this is an interesting one, because although it's retrospectively obvious, it's not something that people often think about. And the key here is that, without wanting to try and sound snobbish, because I think it's important that we don't sort of make value judgments here, perspective, experience of other cultures is clearly opening people's minds to the EU, and that's why people who haven't had that experience less likely to stay.
And that, of course, the fear that they'll lose freedom of movement is one of the main irritants for younger people.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think we're going to come on, or as you already mentioned, in fact, the age factor, and I'm sure that culture is one part of it.
Now, this one is a little bit looser. It shows that the highest Leave votes tended to come from low-income areas. That was something which you were talking about there.
Yeah, I mean, these are voters who really haven't benefited as much from the global market and European integration as much as, say, voters in London, right? But the other interesting thing here as well is about turnout. In a lot of the London areas where you have higher incomes and more economic security, Camden, for example, Hackney, Lambeth, Lewisham, turnout was low. Much lower than average. But in some of these declining, disadvantaged areas, turnout was quite high.
Now, what about the other divisions? Because this doesn't always work, does it? Because, we've got Northern Ireland and Scotland. I mean, both of them not the richest areas by any means in the country, and yet most people voted to remain there. So other factors can affect this.
Yeah, and Scotland for me is a really interesting one here, because we found when we did the analysis at the FT in a couple of these charts the broad pattern was true in Scotland, but essentially all of those Scottish regions were pulled towards the Remain side. So there's clearly something that we're not capturing in demographics, which is the culture up there. Obviously, they had their independence referendum recently. There's clearly something inherently up there, or something we're simply not measuring, which is making Scotland a lot more pro-EU.
What about the sexes? Any difference between men and women?
Minimal. I mean, there was a very slight difference in terms of men being more likely.
Michael Thrasher said to me, majority of women mildly favoured Remain, and men rather more heavily wanted out.
That's correct, but I think the strength of that relationship relative to some of these other ones we're seeing was weaker.
Any other significant divisions that you picked up on?
Well, you know, class, generation, geography, we are a very divided nation on the question of Europe. I think now seeing where the debate is going around the second referendum is really interesting, because I ran some numbers this morning where you have support for the second referendum, where that is strongest among Remain voters who are not happy with the result. There's a strong correlation with low turnout at the first referendum. Places like Diane Abbott's seat of Hackney, for example, where you had turnout at around 63–64%, but you now have support for a second referendum off the chart. So it seems that voters who didn't turn out at the first referendum now want a second referendum.
Well, as we were reporting, there is this petition. Now over 2 million people have signed the petition asking for a second referendum. I mean, I have to say, personally, I'm not a fan of referendums at all in most circumstances. As a professor of politics, it would be outrageous, wouldn't it, to have another referendum after we've just had one?
Be very surprising. We might have another referendum in Scotland, of course, where the SNP have just been dealt a really strong hand. But referendums more generally are problematic. They put two groups against one another in a fairly divisive way. They're not they're not made for complex decisions and deliberation.
Difficult final question. Would you change the electorate? I mean, some people are saying, you know, for long-term decisions, people over 60 shouldn't be allowed to vote. Younger people.
I mean, that's obviously absurd for all sorts of reasons. I just don't think there's any argument for that. However way you look at, you crunch the numbers, really.
Is there an argument for 16-year-olds getting votes?
I think that's certainly more appealing of the two, and yeah, I mean, personally, I'd be for that.
OK, well, thank you both very much indeed. Let's have a look at